Hello, everyone, to another episode of Podium Stories. Today we have a very special guest that I've been looking forward to chat for a long time. Emily, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, just to give some context, Emily is the head of growth and partnerships and community at Voiceflow. She's the founder of GrowthTO. She's been previously growth at a few different very interesting companies. One Stills was acquired by Airbnb. Emily, can you start by giving our audience a bit more context on your current head of growth and partnerships and community at Voiceflow? Can you tell us a bit more about what Voiceflow does as a company and what you do specifically as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So Voiceflow is a no-code, low-code solution to let anybody design, prototype, or even launch conversation experiences. So that could be anything from Alexa, Google Assistant, Messenger, or anything that's kind of in this new age of voice and conversations. And my role there, I'm their head of growth. So that means because we're an early stage startup, lots of different things, but ultimately what I'm trying to do is carve out what are our potential avenues, potential ways of empowering the most designers and developers as possible, and also kind of formalizing what that looks like in our community.
I love it. I wanted to ask you, where does the interest in community building, which is the main topic that I want to kind of go with you today, come from for you? I know that I was reading that you were hosting concerts at an early age, and that could be something that sparked it. I was just wondering, where does the specific interest in community building come from?
Yeah, I feel like every community builder has like unintentionally just been that type of person that's always been like the serial organizer. Like I always talk about serial entrepreneurs, but serial organizer is definitely a type. It's that one friend in your friend group that manages to rally you all the time, or it could be on more of an organizational level, like the club head, or someone who's overly involved in school or overly involved in councils. And I think like what that boils down into like businesses or SaaS now is there's that person who organizes and rallies your user base and creates kind of a different avenue for the business to really explore. And for me, I think you nailed it. You must have definitely gone on my old personal website.
Oh, we do our research here. We do our research.
I apologize. That reminds me I need to update that. But
yeah, by the way, I was gonna tell you on camera.
but for me, I guess I started kind of being more in the music industry, I was in a band at the time. I ended up realizing that the community space for local indie bands that were up and coming was abysmal at the time. It's like a long time ago. And then I ended up creating my own company that was community oriented around that. So built a community of indie bands, ended up booking out venues so we could have more of what the bands wanted, which was time to play, access to recording, access to fans, and genre parity. And that kind of like ballooned into other things that I was interested in, where at school, realizing there wasn't a community for, at the time, like designers or people that were interested in like no-code tools, which I didn't know was really a thing at the time, but unintentionally made that, and then fell into Tilt, where unintentionally fell into this role of gathering other people like myself or other people who are interested in empowering more college organizers or university organizers. And that ended up spurring a lot of the stuff we did with the ambassador program, and then PartnerStack more formally with building out communities for larger companies like Asana, Unbounce, Intuit, and getting creating or working on a product that helped to enable more communities from an affiliate side. And then more specifically now with Voiceflow, doing that again, but from more of like a professional standpoint of,
right.
Instead of it being like local groups or students or things like that, now they're professionals.
I love it. So it's been a long time coming from you. We kind of touched on the past. I want to fast forward to the future as well, because we keep hearing that community-led companies are the future. I was reading an article by the co-founder of Reddit talking about how in 5 years he thinks that more than half of the top 500 publicly traded companies are going to have a CMO, as in Chief Community Officer. I was wondering, first of all, what do you think is the current acceptance of how important community is to companies, and how can we communicate the language of the C-suite to talk about why communities are important, how they can drive tangible results for their business, so we can get a seat at the table.
Yeah, so I think like community-led growth is a hot topic right now, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's one that I think is incredibly important and has been spurred up a lot more as we've lost a lot of that proximity that we normally get from obviously being in contact with real humans. And we all know it's a weird process right now. So a lot of us have resorted to online groups, forums, online communication. But even with a lot of that, we still crave as human beings connection beyond our own group. Or more targeted connection around a certain topic or a skill sharing opportunity. And I think the important opportunity to really dive down on with why community is so important for these companies, and a distinction to be made here is that it's important because it spurs a totally different communication channel and a totally different defensive moat that a company can have that is not bent on like a one-sided communication, where it's not like, oh, join my email list and I will send things to you. It is very much so like a place to meet, almost like building like a meeting ground and trying to make sure that you're fostering an actual behavior or modes of communication, modes of engagement that may extend outside of your product, and it's sticky. And I think that the big distinction here, where there's no company that's going to say, no, I don't want a community. Like everyone's to be like, yeah, like, I want that.
Sure. Yeah.
But there's also a way to do it that I think is the distinction here that more and more companies are learning, where the most successful communities are not the ones that are all about the company that started them. It's all about the users that are within it. And it's all about like potentially around a topic that is important to them. So you look at like Notion, for instance, which has a really big community around it. They're all productivity junkies. Like they're not necessarily like, I love Notion, I'm going to go in this group and just talk about how much I love Notion, which obviously comes with a lot of the posts that's there. But it's really more like, I found this awesome hack for productivity that I built in Notion, check it out. So that's kind of one side of it. And I think the second, in terms of like justifying it, which was your second question in there, is when you talk to, let's say, if you want to start a community, you want to foster that, get that buy-in because it's important, is setting aside like what your initial goals for that community is versus long-standing goals that you can get. So there's
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, like there's this age-old question of like, what's the ROI of a community? Because everyone has a hard time like really quantitatively explaining that. And what I mean by separating early stage versus long term there is just like when you're doing like a growth experiment, like your MVP isn't necessarily going to give the exact same results or long-standing measurements as the full-blown experiment itself. So when you first start your community, it's really more about like initial engagement and like the first 10 people that you invite in and like what you're building there. And then that's going to expand into like your initial goal for that community might be instant product feedback. Like it might just be like, I want to put all my power users in a group and I'm going to get feedback because we're a B2B company and B2B companies have like really long product feedback cycles. I want it to be more instant like B2C. So that's my initial goal. And that might evolve to a certain point where you get like a couple hundred users in there. Now it's a mix of new users and old users. Like now you want this to be more of like a moderation and like help community. So like, how do you inspire that? How do you get that? And the impact would be like less time for support, therefore like more productivity for the company and that sustained product feedback. And that can keep evolving into like affiliates or things like that later on.
Interesting. I want to get tactical on that sense. One of the things that I think are super relevant when it comes to community building is the engagement that happens, right? And in the community that we run, that's one of the main challenges and opportunities that we have, I think. So how do you, one, is there anything that you do to measure community engagement from a quantitative point? I think qualitatively, we're able to understand like this is, so conversations are happening organically, but from a quantitative point, is there any way, or should we even measure community engagement? And I was wondering what your thoughts are on that end.
Yeah, so I think like there's always a difference between like health metrics and like campaign metrics. So like in this case, like I like to like measure or keep a pulse on health metrics just to make sure that like this is a community that people actually enjoy being in and they actually engage with. So like there are small things in there, like what's the ratio of posts that we make as a company versus ones that are organically spurting and actually like answered by members in the community. And then there's tools that have like base levels of that. Like I like to keep a healthy ratio of like, similar to how companies will measure like monthly active users, like I want to measure monthly active engagements or monthly active users in that community. So ideally you're growing that community in terms of users, but that like X percentage of active members remains or continues to grow a little bit. So that's more like your vital signs. And
Do you have
then,
any, sorry to interrupt, do you use any
yeah.
tech stack specifically there that you would recommend to track these things? Or is that something that you can do manually?
So it really depends on what channel you're using. So with community, this is another thing that I hope gets solved at some point. And I know there are companies that are working on this, but that there's a decentralized approach to community right now where it's like at a high level, do you like build or do you like buy or kind of exist on an existing platform? And then like there's a additional question on there is like, do you exist in multiple places or do you exist in one? So some channels do offer like natural analytics into it. So like Facebook groups, for instance, do have like a gauge of how many new members, what your member growth is, what your activation rate is, or I guess active engagement. I normally look at that one because our Facebook one is personally our highest one. And then we also have our forum on Discourse, which also has natural analytics, but there are some tools like you have like Comsor or things like that, where you can plug in multiple platforms that you have and measure them kind of across the stack.
I love it. One of the things that we found is the existence of super users, if you want to call it like that. I'm making a term, I'm not sure how to call it. But those are users that are ideal in the sense of they fit our persona, and they're the most engaged, the ones that are driving the conversation forward. And I'm guessing this tend to happen in all communities. How do you empower those super users? And how can you make the most of them? Because you want to provide the most useful experience for them since they're adding so much value to the community. Is there anything that you guys do to like reward those super users?
Absolutely. Like community is building relationships with people. Like it's the same way that you would like nurture your best friends versus your acquaintances versus like people that you're really interested in getting to know. Like it's a lot more simple than it seems to be able to identify who are the obvious people that are like up and coming and exciting in the community, because a good community manager knows them by name. And like I think that's kind of like the first step there is like it's not a transactional thing. It's not like, oh, you posted 10 times, let me give you a sticker. It's like, hey, like I've seen your name come up a bunch, like really want to get to know you, like thanks so much for these things, and like keeping it personal, no matter what stage you're at. Like even more recently, like we did a sprint where I literally hand packaged like 200 sticker packs, and like designed the things, like wrote the things, manually walked to USPS and did it. And like it's not pretty, but then you see all the results of people being like, this is so awesome, like thank you so much for these things. And like that is like true community engagement. But I think like more on like rewarding the people that come through is like people are also in buckets of how they want to be rewarded or what is exciting to them in terms of being a good community member. So you have some that are transactional and you have some that are non-transactional in ways that you quantify that. So non-transactional are like your evangelists, your like workshop owners, your educators, your like helpful, like support ticket, like helpers and like elements like that are like local hosts. I love that camp. They're the absolute best. They're like the most wonderful people to work with always. And I think like for us, it's been like giving responsibility, allowing them to be leads, like empowering them when they do events or giving them and doing more like surprise, like dopamine style rewards, because like it's more conversational, it's more relationship based. And then on the flip side, for transactional, you're going to have certain people that are like crazy net promoters in terms of getting signups, getting people to actually come onto the product, activate. like that is when it's an obvious move to start perhaps more of like an affiliate style program, a certified partners program, or perhaps other methods of doing rev share, elements like that. So it really depends on kind of what the nature of your community is.
I love it. And I guess the $1,000,000 question is, how do we get more super users, right? Can we turn normal users to power users, or is that even a possibility?
Yeah, so I think like that age-old question comes like in tandem with like the classic aha moment, or like how do you activate users? Like there's a path, and I think like the activation route of going from like sign up to active user to power user is something that like needs to be massaged, needs to be kind of like broken out, and ideally like you start to build that into the habit of your community. So like an example of that being like when we were at Tilt, we had a wickedly active ambassador program. And at first, because they were kind of all starting at roughly the same time, like they were kind of like growing up together in terms of how they like leveled up with each other, what the leaderboard was like, all these things. However, a community does reach a point where there's like a lot of super users or power users in a group. And then you introduce new people who are kind of like on the up and coming part of that. And it's terrifying. Like it is so scary for somebody to jump into something where like, oh my God, I'm in a room of experts. I want to be an expert, but I'm really scared.
Right.
And so like for us in that case, and this is just one example of how you do that, was we ended up actually creating like a separate group, like a pre-group, which we named the Hatchery, which is a horrible incubation joke of trying to get them to
I get it.
Awful, would not recommend. But like we put all the net new users in there and a select group of leads from our power users to help instill and empower them in that group. And then when they graduated by hitting X percentage of something or doing X amount of tasks as ambassador, we then put them in. So they're not jumping into a leaderboard where they're at 0. They're not jumping into a conversation where they've never done anything. So there's also elements of that, or even just further graduating that into, at one point we built a portal. And that helped do all that training, that helped get them feel empowered, and also like helped with visibility on like what they could do or inspiration or challenges.
I love it. It's super interesting. And I agree with you that it's really hard for them to come into a group where, you know, everybody's a super user and they want to become an expert, but they might not be there yet and they're on the process. Do you think that engagement is the main metric that drives retainment? So if people are engaging, do you think that's the leading indicator of low churn? Or do you think there are other metrics that are more meaningful to drive lower churn?
I mean, I guess it depends. Like, I mean, in terms of a community versus a product, like a community, I think engagement is key. Because
what about when the community is the product? So let's say it's a private community where you're building that, you know, as a site to maybe support a larger business, but the community is private and maybe they're paying for that. So there's churn within the community. So if people are active there and engaging, do you think that's the number one reason for them to not leave? Or are there other things that, you know, can drive that churn lower?
I would definitely say like engagement is definitely a pretty good like indicator as to whether or not they're interested, whether or not they care about what's going on in the community. What I would say is like other methods, like sometimes there's like silent killers in communities when you think about it. And I mean that in like a good way, not like I'm toxic in this group. I mean that as like there's some people who just like choose to communicate by like consuming information and doing actions rather than participating. So like with all communities that have like goals for that product, like you want to track kind of both of those. So that's kind of why I meant like I track the health of the community, but also like what are my goals for them. So like I'm not going to discount someone who like does not like speaking in a Facebook group, but they happen to like share their referral code a lot. Like they're different in how they contribute to that community, but like it's good to have that basis on both sides, not just in posts.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good perspective. I hadn't thought of it like that. I have a couple more questions, Emily, and I want to let you go because I know you're busy. But one of the things that we're seeing is key to one, have more engagement, and two, reduce churn is the onboarding process. So we're seeing that that's probably one of the key steps for people to really value and get the most value out of the community. Do you have any tips, any thoughts on how a good onboarding process for a community should be run? What are some of the things that we should really hit on? And just from your perspective, driving that community, what's been working and not working from an onboarding standpoint?
Yeah, so like onboarding in community, I think is an unbelievably important space. And like the hatchery in our main group is like a one easy example of like why that's important. But like more systematically, like it's about building habits. So like I find it's always helpful to ground community strategy and like actually how you would invite or like get people to engage in a real life event or like a real life like friend group, where it's not enough to just like invite somebody to come to something. Like you gotta like particularly make that person feel like they're welcome, like there's icebreakers, things like that. And I don't mean like host a weekly Zoom like kumbaya session to get them to feel like they're part of something, but it can be like something as simple as like every Monday, like someone from the team welcomes everybody that is new. And like everybody knows that what normally happens there is that existing members say like welcome. Like it could be something as simple as that, or it can be something as like systematic as like they sign up for the community on the website, which triggers an email campaign that like lets them know about these things as they activate. Or I know you were on my website earlier. There's a good example on there and how we did that with Tilt. But also kind of walking through like maybe you build a more systematic onboarding where like if the goal of your community is like teaching them not just to be like power users of the product, but how to talk about the product, like that also warrants onboarding because it's going to directly contribute to their success of being in that community. So for us, we ended up building out, and if you go through it, I'm sure they're still on YouTube, but there's like tutorials that like I made like in a closet at the time, like explaining this is how we talk about Tilt. And it was a separate onboarding to the product, but it was imperative for like the success of that community. So there's elements of really trying to figure out A, what's the goal of that community? B, are they set up for success in that? Like, and then C, are the habits that we're trying to get them to fall into in the community apparent? And especially as you're growing that community, making sure that you have someone focused on those things is important to the long-term success of it.
Right, which kind of leads me to the last question, and I want to let you go. But from a 10,000 feet point of view, what's the role of the community moderator? So what do you think, if the community moderator does one thing, what should they be doing to make sure that the community is set for success?
So I think like if they're doing one thing, like I think the easy answer is like, you need to actually get to know and talk to the people that are in there. I think like at a super high level, obvious point, you need to be doing those things. I think on the flip side, it's also like, this is a job that it's not a side job. It's not like I spend 5% of my week thinking about these things. It's like just as much of a campaign, just as much of a channel as anything else. So I think like, if you're looking to really nurture it, you have to get not only buy-in from the company, but also like other people in there to help relay those answers, to communicate, to get that, because it is a community effort. And then also just like for your time, like focus on like that time. Like who are the users in there that are going to be awesome at like spreading those habits, like making sure that they're interactive, they're genuine, they feel close with you in the company, and take that time to really nurture that because it plays long-term dividends.
I love it. Emily, thank you so much for your time. I think we could go for an hour, but we'll stop here. Where's the best way to reach you if somebody wants to get your thoughts on community building or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, best place would be probably on Twitter. You can find me at Emily Lonetto on Twitter there. That's Lonetto. And outside of that, you can also find me under my name on LinkedIn, but Twitter will probably be your best and fastest way. Perfect.
We'll put the link there. We'll also put the link to Voiceflow and everything else. Emily, thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye-bye. Cheers.